Recent political developments have put selection at the forefront of education debate.
Every time a school says, I want the power to select who I choose, is to take in the brightest and the best.
Parents are determined to get their children the best education possible.
Everyone only has one stab at education, and one doesn't want to get it wrong. And I think if you have this ability or that ability, then I think you should be in an environment where that's nurtured and you get the most that you possibly can.
Some people undoubtedly start coming to the church because they want to get their child into the school. Sometimes they will tell you that.
At a time when the debate over selection is heating up again, this programme asks, do we still have a selective education system? And if so, what kind of selection is taking place?
I think the benefits of selection here is that children of similar ability and children who need similar challenge will learn together. Because we can think of learning taking place within the classroom, but of course learning takes place throughout the school.
Weald of Kent Grammar School for Girls is one of 164 remaining grammar schools in the state system, many of which are located in Kent, Britain's most selective LEA. Weald of Kent Grammar School is an openly selective school that selects its pupils on the basis of ability. Sue Rowell has been head teacher in the school for over 15 years.
There are some disadvantages for perhaps the community in its entirety, but you've got to balance that against the benefits for individual students who, in the case of grammar schools, want to move at a fast pace, learn with others like them.
Weald of Kent Grammar School has a good reputation in the community. The Mackenzie family has sent 4 daughters to the school, including 16-year-old Emily.
My daughter Emily is at the Weald of Kent. At the moment she's in year 11 and she hopes to continue at the Weald into the 6th form. I chose to send Emily to the Weald of Kent because I've been very, very, very happy with the school. I think it's important that Emily is around other pupils with a similar ability to herself, because I think that they all gain from that. They interact out of school as well as in school. I think it's important they can share their homework as such. If one of them's stuck, and can help one another.
I think when people think of grammar schools, perhaps they think of grammar schools of a bygone era. Maybe grammar schools that they went to, grammar schools that were quite traditional, and perhaps still some are. But I think the vast majority of schools have had to modernise themselves, just the same way as non-selective schools have had to modernise, and that therefore schools have changed immensely over the past 10 years.
I went to the Weald of Kent between 91 and 99, and in all of my years I actually really enjoyed school. It was good because you're with like-minded people and you want to kind of try and do the best that you can, and you never felt like you're under a huge amount of pressure. But because the class sizes in the late kind of 20s, we all had enough attention or help when it was needed, and sort of by having your friends around you that are in a similar position or at a similar stage, you can kind of bounce off and work with each other to try and do the best.
I think that the benefits of selection from an academic point of view, I think that there are people that are going to be high achievers, and I think if we can give them the best we can, then I feel that that's what we should do.
Was it? Yeah. Oh, did you say?
Everyone only has one stab at education, and one doesn't want to get it wrong. And I think if you have this ability or that ability, then I think you should be in an environment where that's nurtured and you get the most that you possibly can.
This was the argument for having a national selective education policy. Rather than mixing children, schools would pick pupils on the basis of their ability. This was institutionalised by the 1944 Education Act, with the tripartite system deciding whether a child would go to a grammar school, secondary modern, or technical school. The shift in policy by the late 1960s ended the tripartite system, deciding that all children should go to non-selective comprehensive schools.
At that time, there was a move to establish comprehensive schools which merged the academic stream and the non-academic stream, doing away with selection. It was beginning to be realised that there was a large degree of error in these tests, and that a large number of mistakes were made about, if you like, which child should go to a grammar school and which one should go to a secondary modern. So there's a very big move at that time, supported, I've got to say, by both Conservative and Labour governments. I think Mrs Thatcher created more comprehensive schools than any other Secretary of State.
The Labour Party has long been against the practice of dividing children by academic ability at the age of 11. I think you have to remember that academic selection at the age of 11 was introduced for a past economic era. It was introduced at a time when the economy only needed 20% of people with high skills and an awful lot of people with fairly low-level skills. Now, that's not the case now. I think you have to ask yourself if the challenge is to produce a society where everybody achieves their potential and has as high a level of skills as possible, is labelling them successes or failure, academic or non-academic, at the age of 11 the right way to go about it?
These are arguments some people in Kent can sympathise with. Jerry Vise is 17 and has lived all his life in the seaside town of Deal in Kent. At 11, he took the 11 plus and passed. But when he went to the local grammar school, things weren't what he had expected.
I was looking forward to it. I thought it would be brilliant. I thought I'd be with like-minded fellow so-called intelligent people and I'll get along fine. But the reality was much different. It was clear from quite early on that it wasn't separating people on the basis of so-called ability. It was more on the basis of class or money. And I didn't enjoy it. And as the years went by there, gradually I felt it got worse. It had little in common with my interests. It had little in common with many other people's interests there, especially those that came from Deal, especially more working class people. Many people felt alienated from it all, and many of these people were the ones that were actually looking forward to it.
In Kent, in Year 6 of primary school, most children are 10 years old. There is an 11 plus test. 25% will pass the test and move on to a grammar school. The other 75% of children go to secondary modern schools. At that point, friendship groups in the primary school playground fragment. Children realign with themselves with children of their own type. It fragments friendship groups, it fragments families, it fragments entire communities.
It was bizarre that there was no football teams. The head of games, with the backing of the headmaster, said that the tradition of the school was in rugby, therefore any talk of football was nonsense. And I continually asked year after year, as did some of my friends year after year, for a football team. But the old argument about it being tradition came back and back to us without any real rationality or logic, other than tradition. It represented how things that were quite common in everyday life were disregarded as unusual. Any idea of doing something that was perhaps normal or perhaps more working class was somehow ridiculous or inferior.
There is an ancient mythology that some people cling to, that selective systems are the route out of poverty for the working class child or the child from the deprived background. The evidence is, in an LEA like Kent and any other selective school, the evidence is that it's actually the children of the most privileged backgrounds that actually take up those places.
I know why I passed the 11 plus, and I know what influenced why I passed it, and I think it was largely based on practice papers. And there's no doubt that I answered many of them questions in that test because I'd practiced with them papers and received help from my mother, who was a teacher. I don't think it was a base around natural intellect as such that I was born with.
People that do support selection tend to focus very much on one side of the coin, which is the grammar school side. I have never, and I've lived in Kent now 13 years, I've never heard one parent saying, oh, I so long for my child to be in a secondary modern because I know that's the most suitable place for it. Never.
There were many people that came from private schools, and it was quite simple. They groomed them up to pass the test, and if many people told me there, if they hadn't have passed the test, they'd have just gone on to another private school. So it wasn't helping people from lower classes that were so-called naturally clever, it was helping higher class people get a free education off the state.
I think we have to admit that for some children it worked. And I wouldn't for a minute say that academic selection failed all children, but I think it failed an awful lot of children. And having said that, it's really important to remember that if it worked for some children, that type of education, whatever there was that was good about grammar school education, and there was a lot that was good, has to find a home in our secondary school system.
So if the government is against selection, why, in places like Kent, are grammar schools still being allowed to select?
I'm absolutely convinced that had the Labour government in 1997 said one of our main priorities is to end selection in the 164 schools where we still got selection, I'm absolutely convinced that that would have become the dominating message of our first term. And if we'd have allowed that to happen, we wouldn't have done literacy and numeracy, we wouldn't have done excellence in cities, we wouldn't have done teacher reform, we wouldn't have done all those things which I think raise the standards across the board.
Instead of taking responsibility themselves as central government for ending the 11 plus system, what they did was completely dodge the issue, and they put responsibility for ending the 11 plus selection into the hands of parents.
What we did decide to do was to remove it from us. We said we're not going to do anything, but we are going to give the power to parents in the areas where grammar school selection exists to do something if they wish.
The balloting system put in place in 1998 gave parents the option of closing down local grammar schools.
In fact, what we found was that the petitioning and ballot regulations were impossible to enforce. In Kent, you would have to get something in the order of 55,000, not just signatures, A4 sheets of paper with lots of detail about the family, the child, and so on and so forth. And another problem to even getting those was schools couldn't send out the petition forms, so you had no idea who the parents were. The whole balloting system is, well, completely flawed.
I'm relatively comfortable with the system. I know that there's only been one ballot that's taken place since the new system was introduced in 1998 in Ripon in Yorkshire. But in the end, all the parents that have a stake in the selection system have a say, including those who, if you like, would see themselves as losers. And in the end, it's up to them. You know, it's as likely they'll be losers, or their children will be losers as winners out of a selection system. And they need to take that rational view and decide whether or not for themselves they want to proceed with a selective system.
I think what I might do, but I can say this because I'm not a minister any longer, I think that there is a time now to make sure that the original intention of that legislation to hand the power to parents does work. And if we find that it doesn't work, politicians should be brave enough to look at it. But I wouldn't want to solve the problem by taking the power back to central government at all.
I can't see any end to the 11 plus system in Kent under the current Prime Minister. There have been education secretaries, David Blunkett, Estelle Morris, Charles Clarke, a raft of education secretaries who have all roundly condemned 11 plus selection. And even now, the Conservative Party has said no more 11 plus selection. So there isn't one political party which thinks it's a good system. So we're all agreed there then, but nobody seems to be willing to do anything about it.
But debates on selection haven't just been concerned with the age-old argument about grammar schools. Selective admissions policy once again became the source of public debate with the recent white paper and subsequent bill on schools. The new white paper on schools promised more independence and power to head teachers. But what exactly that would mean for admissions caused concern among some.
Why is a Prime Minister with a majority of 70 struggling to explain to his own MPs why we need to reform our schools?
Schools will have the freedom and independence we want them to have, but within a system of fair funding and fair admissions. And I say to my honourable friend that if people want that strengthened admissions code and procedure, the only way to get it is to vote for the bill.
This bill will build on what we know works best. It will give heads the powers they need to forge new partnerships and to drive up standards in their schools.
There has been a move in recent years over quite a considerable period of time to allow schools more independence. And I think that's been welcomed broadly by almost everyone. The question of admissions has gone along with that up to a point. But I think in recent years it has been understood more clearly that unless there are some checks and balances in the system, schools that are oversubscribed do drift upmarket. They do, over a period of time, decide for one reason or another, even if most people involved in it don't want to do it, they do drift along the process of selecting easier to teach children.
Admissions is still a big issue because there's a lot of pressure on schools now to achieve. There's the performance tables, there's their standing in their community, and success breeds success. And the easiest way for a school to zoom up the performance tables is start taking in children who are brighter, who work hard, who've got supportive families. It's the easiest way to get your school up the performance tables and to be considered a good school. Put it this way, I've never met a head who has decided to introduce selection into his school so that they can take the worst performing children, most at risk of exclusion, with parents who aren't supportive in an area of deprivation. Every time a school says, I want the power to select who I choose, is to take in the brightest and the best. I mean, I have heard the most appalling stories. I was told of a school once who would only take in children, this was a primary school, where their parents were married to each other. It was a church school, but even then, I don't see why. Now, I think I know why they were saying that, but it's just not justifiable.
Is this a trend that's been growing? Are comprehensive schools trying to select certain pupils? Professor Anne West has been doing research into covert selection for years and has found that schools in charge of their own admissions are more likely to use diverse criteria such as family ties to the school, aptitude and ability in their admissions policy.
The problems with using ability or aptitude, on the face of it, you think, well, maybe there isn't a problem. But in practice, the problem is you're going to give priority to certain groups of children over others. So, for example, you're more likely to be privileging those children who, for one reason or another, have had the opportunity for music lessons, for example. Children who've got special educational needs or come from disadvantaged backgrounds might not have had those opportunities, so might not be able to get access to schools because of that. I mean, the problem with selecting children of employees and children whose parents have been to the school is it allows opportunities for schools to say, well, you know, we think that you're the sort of child who might benefit from coming here. Not only that, we might benefit from having you here. Maybe you'll be an easier to teach pupil. Maybe you'll do better in your exam results. It allows that discretion, and it allows what some people have called covert selection to take place. Religious schools are entitled to select children on the basis of their religious denomination or faith. That is permitted. But what one doesn't really know is how they go about that. We do know from research that we've carried out that some schools do ask for elaborate forms to be completed, and they ask for information about where the child lives, the sort of accommodation they live in, whether they live in bed and breakfast accommodation, whether they've got special educational needs, the occupations of the parents, the occupations of siblings. And all of these allow opportunities for schools to make choices about who they would like to offer places to. And it just raises concerns.
Following backbencher pressure, the new admissions code was introduced as part of the schools bill to try and stop selection by the back door.
In the education bill that's going through Parliament at the moment, we are introducing a much tougher new admissions code, which all admissions authorities must act in accordance with, rather than, as is the case at the moment, act with regard to. And that will remove some of the backdoor selection methods.
It may have more effect than the last code of practice. Whether it'll have the desired impact overall remains to be seen.
Placing checks and balances on a competitive marketplace is not easy, especially in education. Parents often stand ready to do what it takes to make sure they secure the best option available, even in the face of strict regulation.
But within comprehensive schools, if you give the choice to the parent, they will, because that's their job, they will put themselves in the best possible position to advantage their child, and long may they continue to do that, because if kids' parents don't stand up for them, they'll find life quite difficult.
Ambitious parents are something Reverend Stephen Coles is familiar with. He has been at St Thomas's Church in North London for 17 years and has seen admissions creep up the agenda among some of his churchgoers.
If you look at the socio-economic mix of the area and then look at the socio-economic mix of the school, you would have to conclude that a process of selection had taken place. The local church school is called St John's Highbury Vale. If somebody wants to get their child into the reception class at school, they will get an application form from the school, and if they claim church involvement, they have to bring that to their parish priest to countersign and comment on the way that they have claimed that they are involved in the life of the church. And that is then used by the governors to discern whether the person genuinely qualifies or not. The requirement is that they are regular and committed members of a particular congregation. These words are not very carefully defined, and it's not at all clear to me that all the clergy interpret them in the same way. So that's the beginning of some of the invidious stuff about the admissions policy, because you're asked to make a rather, as far as I'm concerned, too valued a judgment. Some people undoubtedly start coming to the church because they want to get their child into the school. Sometimes they will tell you that very early on. In terms of what motivates parents to send their children to the church school, I think it's both. I think it's faith and there's class involved. I think given that we're dealing with an English educational system, those whose culture is rooted in Englishness probably have a better idea about how systems work and therefore know what to do.
It isn't just religion that has become entangled in the politics of selection. Increasingly, the basic question of where we live has become an integral part of school choice.
In my line of business as an estate agent, a large part of my day is not only spent discussing properties, but also the schools in those given areas. A lot of people will ask my advice on hints and tips on how to get their kids into those schools. Of course, that's not my area of expertise, and I can only advise that they buy in the catchment areas that are for those particular schools. So postcodes are becoming increasingly important. The best secondary schools are in the most expensive areas of St Albans and vice versa. That's true. I mean, we're approaching a Beaumont school here, which is just off the busy Hatfield Road. And as an estate agent, I can tell you that buying a property on a busy thoroughfare with lots of commercial and domestic traffic would normally be a faux pas and something that people would steer away from. However, in St Albans, properties along the Hatfield Road seem to sell very, very quickly indeed. So that's something that I've always found quite an interesting phenomenon.
I'm not happy about people buying houses to get into decent schools. I'm not happy about that at all. But my analysis of why that's a problem is that we don't have enough good schools. Solve the problem of poorly performing schools and you solve the problem of parents paying a lot to live in the catchment area of a good school.
Whether we call it academic or call it social selection, or decide that those lines are blurred, the issue of schools selecting easy-to-teach pupils from affluent backgrounds continues to be part of education debate.
The people it did help were the well-off, the ones with money, the ones that came from a class that was higher up, or the ones that came from a situation where they could rig the system.
I think ideologically, I don't think selection has to be part of our system, but I think realistically, it probably always will be.
I think to end selection, there would need to be a political will to do so. And I remain to be convinced that there's a political will to do so.
It seems to be very odd that people can be walking out of front gates that are side by side at the age of 5 or 6 and going off to separate schools. I don't understand what is really going. Well, I fear I do understand what is going on behind that, and I don't think it's desirable, and I think it has nothing to do with Christianity.
We are a deeply class-ridden society still. It's one of the things that marks us out from other Western democracies. And I do wonder if this debate we have about academic selection is in some respects a consequence of that. But whether it's a consequence of that, and it's something that's inbred in us almost, or whether it just is this facing up to the factor that we've still not got yet a situation where every school is a good school, selection and the debate about selection, whether it be academic selection or social selection, I think is going to be with us for some time yet.